Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 85th deck and it's titled Blood Money is Due. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck around a theme of the chosen card. So first up, before we get into the actual deck tech, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can reach out to us, help support the channel, or just keep in contact if that's something you're looking to do. So the first few ways, we have Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All of those are great ways to reach out to us if you ever have any questions, if you just want to talk about some decks or some cards, or if you want to make any suggestions for cards that you'd like to see turned into decks for this. I'm happy to listen to all of those. And if you're looking to support us a little bit more directly, you can head on over to TCG Player and use our affiliate link, which is in the description of this video. And the most direct way is actually Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. There you can support us very directly, and in return, we will give you access to things like the deck lists an entire week early, access to the Discord channel where we actually brew up some of the decks and also play some of the games. So if you're interested in playing some games on the channel, that is a great way to do that. And there's also the ability to see the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players interacting with each other and joking around rather than just my own narration. And finally, I will also send you once a month one of our random cards of the month, so that way you can get a little bit of cards to play the game on your own, maybe build some of these decks if that's something you're interested in doing. And of course, a huge shout out to our 4 current patrons. We've got William Swiftfoot, Eric Huey, Doodle, and Calvin Schmidt. So to the 4 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And if none of this sounds like your style, or maybe you're just not able to support right now, I completely understand. You can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That really does help out quite a bit. So thank you all so much for watching, and I suppose it's time to get into the deck tech. So first up, we got to talk about our random card of the week. This one was suggested to us by Thomas K. I hope I pronounced that right. I apologize if I did not, via email. And the card that he suggested was Tivash, Gloom Summoner. And Tivash is a 4 and a black for a legendary creature, human warlock. He's a 4/4 with lifelink. And at the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, you may pay X life, where X is the amount of life you gained this turn. If you do, create an XX black demon creature token with flying. So I'm not going to lie, Tivash is a card that I've seen in quite a few decks, particularly my wife's Dina deck, because she plays that and kicks my butt with it pretty regularly. But I've never thought about using Tivash as a commander. So obviously, since we have a legendary creature as our random card of the week, that does make Tivash our commander as well. So we are mono black this week, and I'm very excited to see what kind of shenanigans we can get up to. So of course, since we are talking about a full commander deck, we got to talk about the themes in the deck. The first one, which you may be able to guess by what Tivash does, is life gain. We want to make sure that we are gaining as much life as possible, so that way at the end of our turn, we can make as big of a demon as possible. So we have things like Sun Droplet, which is 2 mana for an artifact. Whenever you're dealt damage, put that many charge counters on Sun Droplet. At the beginning of each upkeep, you may remove a charge counter from Sun Droplet. If you do, you gain 1 life. Now, obviously, this isn't going to help us make a massive demon, but it does fit into the synergies of gaining a bunch of life, in this case in very small doses, but it's still what we want to be doing. And one of the main reasons we want to be doing that is because we have cards that care about life gain as a whole. So, for example, we have Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which is 1 black for a vampire rogue. She's a 2/3 with flying. Whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Bloodthirsty Aerialist. So the wording of this, especially combined with Sun Droplet, is very interesting, because Bloodthirsty Aerialist doesn't care if you gain 1 life or if you gain 100 life. You only get the 1/+1/+1 counter. So Sun Droplet, gaining us 1 life every single upkeep, is going to trigger Bloodthirsty Aerialist every single upkeep. So if, for example, we cast it and then we have 3 opponents plus ourselves, by the time it gets back to us 4 turns later, Bloodthirsty Aerialist should be a 6/7 flying, which is incredibly powerful considering we just played it for 3 mana. So We have a ton of cards that care about those small life gains from Sun Droplet, but we also have cards that care about gaining a ton of life at once. And then that leads us to our final theme, which is, since we have a ton of life, we want to be able to spend that life. We want to use our life as a resource to be able to cast things we shouldn't, activate abilities we shouldn't, and just try to get a little bit ahead of our opponents. So, for example, we have Bolas's Citadel, which is 3 black, black, black for a legendary artifact. You may look at the top card of your library anytime, and you may play the top card of your library, and if you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than pay its mana cost. Tap, sacrifice 10 non-land permanents, each opponent loses 10 life. Now, for the most part, we don't really care too much about that final ability on Bolas's Citadel. It's really here so we can play things from the top of our library by spending life rather than spending mana. Because if we're able to keep spending life and keep gaining life, we can play a ton of cards with Bolas's Citadel because we're going to have the life to be able to do it. And there's a good chance we'll have more life than we do mana, so that is exactly why it's here. So that is what our deck is trying to do. We're trying to gain life, we're trying to take advantage of gaining life, and then once we've gained a ton of life, we want to be able to spend it to get even more advantage. So obviously, a deck is not complete without some key cards that really help things run, and this deck is no different. So first up, when we're talking about key cards, we have Pontiff of Blight. This is 4 black, black for a zombie cleric. It's a 2/7 with extort, and other creatures you control have extort. Now, a reminder, extort is whenever you cast a spell, you may pay either a white or a black. If you do, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain that much life. So in Commander, if we have 3 opponents, we extort 1 time, each opponent loses 1 life, but we actually gain 3 life. So if we can give every single creature we have extort, we could gain 3, 6, 9, 12 life just by casting 1 spell and dumping a little bit of extra mana into it. And then at the end of turn, well, we just gained 12 life. We might as well pay that life into Tivash, make a 12/12 flying demon, and we can really get out of hand very quickly with the ability to extort off of multiple creatures. Now, originally when I built this deck, I wanted to make it an extort deck, so there are a lot of extort cards in here, but there's actually not that many in mono black, so I couldn't make the whole deck around extort, even though it is a very strong mechanic for what we're trying to do. But I did include all the ones that I could, which I believe was only about 5 or 6 cards, unfortunately. Now, leading into our next key card, we have Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, which is 2 and a black for a legendary creature, human cleric. No, he's not a human, is he? He's a vampire. Ooh, that's even better. So a vampire cleric, 1/3. Whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life, and you can pay 3 black, black. Creatures you control gain lifelink until the end of turn. So Veto is able to turn all of our life gain into life loss for our opponents. So to use the Pontiff of Blight example, we extort something for 1. Each opponent loses 1 life, we gain 3 life, and then Veto lets us do 3 more damage to an opponent. So someone's going to lose 4 life, the other 2 lose 1, and we still gain 3, just for having these 2 cards in play and extorting 1 time. So if we can give our entire team lifelink, if we can gain a bunch of incremental life, if we can just gain a whole chunk of it, it doesn't really matter. Veto scales with how much life we gain, unlike something like the Bloodthirsty Aerialist. So we can kind of do this in whatever order we want and with whatever cards we want. And this is, for all intents and purposes, a win condition for this deck because it's going to start knocking people out once we're gaining a ton of life. And finally, our last key card is going to be Witch of the Moors. So a very unique card. This is a jumpstart card, so I don't think I've ever seen it in play, actually. But it is 3 black, black for a 4/4 human warlock. It's got Death Touch. And at the beginning of your end step, if you gained life this turn, each opponent sacrifices a creature, and you return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Now that is an incredibly powerful ability because we really do intend to be gaining life every single turn. So as long as we've gained any life, it could be 1 life, it could again be 100 life, each opponent has to sacrifice a creature, which is already pretty good, and we get to return a creature card from our graveyard to our hand. That gets us back our Pontiff of Blight, that gets us back our Veto, our Bloodthirsty Aerialist. Any creatures that have died up to this point, we can just put back into our hand and replay. So we can constantly just gain life, take away our opponent's value by making them sacrifice creatures, and then regain our own value by constantly recasting our own creatures. So Witch of the Moors does exactly what we want. And honestly, like I said, I've never really seen it in play, so I am very excited to see it run in this deck. But those are our key cards, and the next thing we've got to do is take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that synergize and work very well together in the deck. The first pair of cards that I want to talk about is Oathsworn Vampire and Bantu's Monument. So Oathsworn Vampire, 1 and a black for a 2/2 Vampire Knight. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you may cast Oathsworn Vampire from your graveyard if you gained life this turn. If we combine that with Bantu's Monument, which is 3 mana for a legendary artifact, black creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. Now, like I mentioned with Witch of the Moors, we're pretty much going to be gaining life every single turn. If we're not, then we're kind of struggling a bit. So that means we're always going to be able to cast Oathsworn Vampire from our graveyard. But if we're able to combine that with Bantu's Monument plus any sacrifice outlet, we can sacrifice Oathsworn Vampire. He goes to the graveyard. We cast him again from the graveyard, assuming we've gained any life. That gains us a life with Bantu's Monument and makes each opponent lose a life. But because Oathsworn Vampire is a black creature, that only costs us 1 black mana. So as much black mana as we have, we could keep sacrificing the vampire, keep replaying the vampire, and keep draining out our opponents. So obviously this isn't an infinite loop. We're not able to make black mana by sacrificing a creature. The cards that do that tend to be a little bit more expensive and couldn't be included in the deck. And honestly, they wouldn't be super great because this is the only real synergy we have like that, but still something to keep in mind. So Oathsworn Vampire and Bantu's Monument is a great just engine that you can get going, but if you have the right pieces, could even just win the game. So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 looks a little bit different and gets to play with one of my favorite cards of all time, Revenge of Ravens. So Revenge of Ravens, we're going to combine that with Marauding Blight Priest. So Revenge of Ravens, 3 and a black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, that creature's controller loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. And if we can combine that with something like Marauding Blight Priest, which is 2 and a black for a creature, Vampire Cleric, 3/2, whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. Now, I'm not going to lie, there's a solid chance that I have used this exact same cool interaction in a previous video. I don't quite recall off the top of my head, but I absolutely love both of these cards, and I've always seen these two overperform whenever they're in a deck. And I'm going to take like 5 seconds to talk up Revenge of Ravens and say that you should definitely play it if you're in a black deck, because this card is amazing and I've never seen it do anything poorly in a game. So play Revenge of Ravens if you can, because it's great. And I have mixed feelings on the fact that it's over $1 now, because 1, I'm very happy that more people are playing it, because you should, and I'm very upset because now it makes it harder to put into decks. But anyway, quick rant over, back to the pair at hand. So if someone attacks us with Revenge of Ravens in play, they lose a life and we gain a life. If we also have Marauding Blight Priest in play, that means that we will gain a life, they'll lose a life, and then because we gained a life, they lose another life. So our opponents are going to have to spend 2 life to attack us while we still gain a life on each creature that attacks. So not only is that going to disincentivize attacks, because people aren't going to want to pay 2 life for each creature to attack us, it also makes combat math very difficult for our opponents, because they might see that they can do 20 damage, but that damage is really going to be down to 10, and they'll lose 20. I guess they might lose more depending on how many creatures and how much damage there is, but say they're all 1/1s. They're going to lose a lot of life, we're going to gain some life, and we're not going to take as much damage as they expect us to. So in the end, this might just stop people from attacking us in general, or it might actually just knock out the person attacking us, or just force them to spend removal. So honestly, I can't talk enough about how great Revenge of Ravens is and how great Marauding Blight Priest is, and if you have any synergies with either of these 2 cards, they should be in your decks. But I won't go too much into that. I'm sure I've already gone too much into that in the past, and I'll probably do so again in the future because I love these cards. They're great. But that brings us to the end of the actual deck tech itself. So the last piece that we have to talk about, since this is a budget show, is of course the price of the deck. And this week, the price came in very close to $100, $99.35. And a big portion of that comes from our most expensive card, which is Exquisite Blood. Now, Exquisite Blood is a $20 card, so if you are looking to trim the price of the deck, you can get this down to $79, which is a huge, I was going to say increase, but I guess technically a decrease in price, an increase in value, I suppose. So that's something you could do. However, Exquisite Blood is one of those cards that doesn't straight up win you the game sometimes, but most of the time it does just win the game, not on its own, but in pretty darn close. So anyway, let's read the card. Exquisite Blood, 4 and a black for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. Now, we've already talked about a couple of cards, mainly Veto, that say whenever you gain life, an opponent loses that much life. Veto combined with Exquisite Blood is an infinite combo that wins us the game, because we'll make an opponent lose 1 life, so they lost a life, we gain a life, Veto sees us gain a life, so it makes an opponent lose a life, which triggers Exquisite Blood again, and the cycle continues. We also have at least 3 other cards that do exactly what Veto does, meaning that we have multiple infinite combos in this deck, but they all revolve around Exquisite Blood. So if you're looking to have a much more high-powered deck with an infinite win condition just kind of as a backup, then I suggest including Exquisite Blood. However, if you're looking to trim the price and also take out an infinite combo, then Exquisite Blood is definitely the card to cut because it is the main synergy piece for any infinite combos, and it's $20, so it's an easy cut to make for price. On the other hand, though, if you are looking for cards to add to the deck to increase the price of the deck and or just improve the deck in general, I have some suggestions for you there. Normally, I wouldn't include this many suggestions. I actually have 3. 2 of them are very similar, and they're also kind of lame, as bad as that sounds, because the first one is going to be Cabal Stronghold, which is a land that taps for a colorless mana, but you can also pay 3, tap it, and add a black for each basic swamp you control. So obviously, you can just replace a swamp for that because it's a land, and I would also recommend Cabal Stronghold's bigger brother, Cabal Coffers, which is pay 2, tap, add a black for each swamp you control. Unfortunately, Cabal Coffers doesn't tap for mana on its own, so if we don't have enough swamps, then it doesn't really do anything. But Cabal Stronghold, about $4. Cabal Coffers, about $16. So they are very expensive cards, but like I said, they're kind of lame because they're just lands, and obviously you replace swamps with them. And I don't normally like suggesting cards that just improve the mana base, but I think in mono black, and especially with how many swamps and how much mana we need for a lot of our cards, they are very worth the include if you're able to squeeze them into the budget. And I do have, like I said, 1 more out of budget upgrade. This one's not a land, I promise, but it is still very good in the deck. And that card is going to be Twilight Prophet. Twilight Prophet, though, 2 black for a 2/4 Vampire Cleric. It's got flying and ascend, so if you control 10 or more permanents, you get the city's blessing for the rest of the game. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have the city's blessing, reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand. Each opponent loses X life, and you gain X life, where X is that card's converted mana cost. So we get to draw an extra card every single turn, and we get to do damage to our opponents and gain life, where X is that card's converted mana cost. Now, if it's a land, obviously that doesn't do anything, but we still get to draw an extra card every turn, which is incredibly relevant, and it has the added benefit of possibly gaining us life and possibly making our opponents lose life. So, if you're able to include that, the card I would recommend replacing it for is Treasure Chest, which is 3 mana for an artifact. You pay 4, sacrifice Treasure Chest, and roll a d20. On a 1, you lose 3 life. On a 2 to 9, you make 5 treasure tokens. On a 10 to 19, you gain 3 life and draw 3 cards. And on a 20, you search your library for a card. If it's an artifact, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand, then shuffle. So I'm a big fan of Treasure Chest. You've probably noticed that it's shown up in quite a few decks that I've made in the past, but the issue is that there's no real synergy for it in this deck. Yeah, it could gain us life and it could draw us cards, but the ideal here is that Twilight Prophet will gain more life and draw more cards over the course of the game than Treasure Chest would. And if we had a way to recur Treasure Chest, or if we needed it for the tutor effect, like we were actively searching for a specific card, then it would be a great card. And I still unironically love Treasure Chest. I do really enjoy it. I think it's a ton of fun. I think it is a good card, but in this deck, Twilight Prophet's just kind of better. So if that is a swap that you would be willing to make, that is what I would recommend. All right, now that brings us to the actual end of our deck tech. That is the whole Tivash deck, but we can't just talk about a deck. We of course have to see how it performs in a game. So we are going to run Tivash up against 3 opponents this week. We are going to run up against Jason in his Savine the Chronoclasm deck, Bilal and Doran the Siege Tower, and Shawn with Brina the Demagogue. So Jason's Savine deck is, I don't want to say a control deck, but it's very much a value deck with some counter spells in there, so it's probably about as close to control as you're going to be able to get in Commander, other than hard locking out the table. So he wants to play a ton of flashback spells, get a ton of value, copy a bunch of stuff, do a ton of damage, and just play almost Spell Slinger that isn't necessarily Storm, but can be Storm in the right situation. So I think overall, I'm not super worried about Savine because I think we're able to gain life to kind of keep away from some of the burn and things like that. However, I don't think we have many responses to the counter spells. He can just kind of counter our big stuff and then we're out of luck. So I am a little bit worried about Savine, and I also have my own personal Savine deck that I know is a menace. So I do understand how strong Savine can be as a commander. Next up, we have Bilal and his Doran the Siege Tower deck. So he wants to make creatures assign damage equal to toughness rather than power, so he's playing a bunch of like 1/5s and 0/8s and creatures that have very big toughness but very little power. So that way he can kind of be the aggro deck at the table and swing in on turn 3 with like a bunch of 0/5 creatures and start doing a ton of damage. Once again, I don't think I'm super worried about this deck. I think that our life gain can handle just being beaten down by some tree folk. But you never know. I'm sure he's got some tricks up his sleeve. He always does. And then finally, we have Shawn and his Brina the Demagogue deck. And I think out of all of them, this is the one I'm the most worried about, because Shawn's Brina deck isn't a hard stacks deck, but it's, I don't know what you'd call it, I guess a soft stacks deck. He wants to play a bunch of tax effects that don't stop his opponents from necessarily playing the game, but forces them to, draw 1 card a turn, maybe not gain life, not be able to attack him. So it's not about not being able to play Magic, but it's about not being able to attack or interact with Shawn. And I think in the end, that's going to be kind of a killer for our deck, because yeah, we can make a bunch of demons, but if he stops us from attacking and he's able to kind of slip Brina through, there's a good chance that Brina just kind of kills us with commander damage over the course of the game. So I think overall, Brina is the one that I'm the most afraid of, but I'm hoping our demons that we make with Tivash can kind of just push through this Bird Warlock and get us there in the end. So we'll see how it goes. I hope you all enjoy the game. I hope you enjoyed the deck tech. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you did, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Jason goes first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and then myself. On Jason's first turn, he plays a tapped Steam Vents. Bilal plays a Plains. Shawn plays a Plains. I play a Swamp. Jason plays a Plains and casts Search for Azcanta, allowing him to surveil at the start of his turn and transform it if there are 7 or more cards in his graveyard. Bilal plays a Command Tower and casts Arcane Signet. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts Orzhov Signet. I play a High Market and cast my own Arcane Signet. In Jason's upkeep, he surveils, putting the top card of his library into his graveyard. Then he plays a Sulphur Falls and casts Gutter Snipe, doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever he casts an instant or sorcery spell. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped and the other into his hand. Shawn plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1, and then casts Archon of Emeria, only allowing each player to cast 1 spell a turn, and also making non-basic lands his opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. I play a Swamp and cast Cryptghast, letting all my swamps tap for 2 black mana. In Jason's upkeep, he surveils, leaving the card on top, and he then plays an island and moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 2. In his second main phase, he casts Catalyst Stone, making all spells with flashback cost 2 less to cast for him and 2 more for his opponents. Bilal plays a forest and casts his commander Doran the Siege Tower, making all creatures assign combat damage equal to their toughness rather than their power. Shawn plays a swamp and casts Together Forever, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Archon and also letting him pay 1 mana to return a creature that dies to his hand if it had a +1/+1 counter on it. I cast my commander Tivash Gloom Summoner, extorting with Cryptghast to make each opponent lose 1 life while I gain 3. I then play a Radiant Fountain, gaining 2 more life. Then, finally, in my end step, I pay 5 life with Tivash to create a 5/5 demon token since I gained 5 life this turn. Also in my end step, Jason casts Think Twice, drawing a card and doing 2 damage to each opponent. Then in Jason's upkeep, he surveils 1, leaving the card on top, plays a mountain, and casts a Talisman of Creativity before passing. Bilal plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Jason's graveyard, and in response, Jason flashes back Think Twice, drawing a card and doing 2 damage to each opponent. Bilal then casts Gorm the Great, not searching his library for his partner, Virtus the Veiled. Shawn plays a Rogue's Passage and casts his commander Brina the Demagogue. He then moves to combat, attacking Jason for 4, triggering Brina since Jason has higher life than another opponent. This allows Shawn to draw a card and put 2 +1/+1 counters on Brina. On my turn, I cast Whip of Erebos, giving all my creatures lifelink, extorting with Cryptghast to make each opponent lose a life while I gain 3. Before I move to combat though, Bilal casts Fracture, destroying the Whip. Once that's resolved, I decide to move to combat anyway, attacking Shawn for 5 and Jason for 4 with Tivash. This triggers Brina, letting me draw a card, but I forget that Shawn also gets to put 2 +1/+1 counters on Brina, letting him block and kill my demon, while Jason takes 4 and I gain 4 life. In my second main phase, I play a Riveteer's Outlook, sacrificing it when it enters to search my library for a swamp, put it into play, and gain a life. Then, in my end step, I pay 8 life with Tivash to make an 8/8 demon token. Also at the end of my turn, Jason casts Arcane Infusion, doing 2 damage to each opponent and looking at the top 4 cards of his library, putting an instant or sorcery from among them into his hand, but unfortunately he doesn't find one. In Jason's upkeep, he surveils 1, putting it into the graveyard. He then plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1, and casts his commander Savine the Chronoclasm, letting him copy the first spell he flashes back each turn, and also preventing all damage that would be dealt to the creature. On Bilal's turn, he casts Mazarek Kraul Death Priest, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures whenever a player sacrifices a permanent. He then attacks me with Gorm for 7, and since it has to be blocked and also has to be blocked by more than one creature, I'm forced to use my demon token and Cryptghast to block it, killing the Cryptghast and Gorm while I take no damage. This attack also triggers Brina, letting Bilal draw a card while Shawn puts 2 more counters on Brina. Then in Bilal's second main phase, he plays an Arctic Treeline and passes. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Ghostly Prison, forcing each opponent to pay 2 mana to attack him. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 9 with Brina, triggering herself, putting 2 counters on the Archon and drawing Shawn a card. Not wanting to take 9 commander damage, I block with my demon, killing the token. On my turn, I play a Swamp and then cast Noxious Gearhulk to destroy Brina and gain 9 life. Unfortunately, Shawn uses Together Forever to return Brina to his hand, so I don't gain the life. Notably, that's not how Together Forever works, as the creature has to die before it can return to hand, so I still should have gained the life, but we don't catch that at the time. In Jason's upkeep, he surveils 1, putting the card into his graveyard, plays a Rugged Prairie, and then passes. Bilal plays a forest and casts Utopia Tree. Then, at the end of turn, Jason casts Frantic Search, doing 2 damage to each opponent, drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, and untapping 3 lands. Shawn plays a Miko Koro Center of the Sea, and casts Kambal Consul of Allocation, doing 2 damage to an opponent when they cast a non-creature spell, and gaining Shawn 2 life. In response, Jason flashes back Faithful Mending, copying it with Savine so he does 2 damage to each opponent, draws 4 cards, discards 4 cards, and gains 4 life. Also in response, Bilal casts Barrier Breach, exiling Ghostly Prison, Together Forever, and Search for Azcanta. Shawn then moves to combat and attacks Jason for 6 in the air with his Archon. I play a Swamp and cast Mask of Grizzlebrand, losing 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life, and I then equip the mask to Noxious Gearhulk, giving it flying and lifelink. I attack Shawn with both of my creatures for 8, but before damage, Shawn casts Fracture, destroying the Mask of Grizzlebrand. This means I still do 8 damage to him, but I only gain 4 life. Then, in my end step, I pay 4 life with Tivash to make a 4/4 demon token. On Jason's turn, he casts an Inspired Ultimatum, doing 2 damage to each opponent, 5 damage to Tivash, killing my commander, gaining 5 life, and drawing 5 cards. In response, Bilal casts Mythos of Nethroi to destroy Guttersnipe. Both of these spells also result in Jason losing 2 life, Bilal losing 2 life, and Shawn gaining 4 life. On Bilal's turn, he casts Collective Unconscious, drawing 3 cards since he controls 3 creatures, losing 2 life, and then Shawn gains 2 life. After that, he plays a Plains, and at the end of turn, Shawn activates Miko Koro so each player draws a card. On Shawn's turn, he recasts his commander Brina and attacks Jason for 6, triggering Brina, putting 2 counters on herself and letting Shawn draw a card. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Jason for 4, triggering Brina so I draw a card and Shawn puts 2 more counters on his commander. Then, in my second main phase, I play a Field of Ruin and cast Crick Son of Yawgmoth, letting me pay 2 life rather than black mana for any spells or activations, and also getting a +1/+1 counter whenever I cast a black spell. Jason plays a Plains and casts Ominous Roost, which creates a 1/1 bird token that can only block creatures with flying when it enters the battlefield and whenever he casts a spell from his graveyard. He also loses 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life. Bilal casts Siphon Mind, losing 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life, and then each of Bilal's opponents discard a card while he draws 3. Then, at the end of turn, Shawn activates Miko Koro, letting everyone draw a card. Shawn plays an Opal Palace and casts Embros Dean of Shadows, letting him draw a card whenever a creature he controls with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, and then attacks me with Brina and the Archon, triggering Brina so Shawn draws a card and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on his commander. I block Brina with my demon, sacrificing it to high market before damage so that I gain a life, and Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. Then I still take 6 damage from the Archon. I cast a Veto Thorn of the Dusk Rose on my turn, making target opponent lose life equal to any amount of life that I gain. This also puts a counter on Crick, and then I move to combat, attacking Shawn for 4, and, before damage, I activate Veto to give my creatures lifelink until the end of turn so that I gain 4 life, and then, thanks to Veto, make Shawn lose 4 more life. Then at the end of my turn, Jason flashes back Arcane Infusion, making a bird token and copying the spell with his commander. This lets him look at the top 4 cards of his library and put an instant or sorcery from among them into his hand twice, putting Dusk Dawn and Desperate Ravings into his hand. This also has him losing 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life. Then on his turn, he casts Dusk, losing 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life, destroying all creatures with more than 2 power. In response, I sacrifice Noxious Gearhulk to high market, gaining a life and making Jason lose a life. This also has the added benefit of putting a +1/+1 counter on all of Bilal's creatures, giving them all 3 power so they die to the board wipe. Then the spell finally resolves, and Shawn draws 2 cards when his creatures die thanks to Embrose. Jason then attacks me for 2 with his birds, and passes. Bilal casts Kolfanor the Last U, and then recasts his commander Doran, and at the end of turn, Shawn activates Miko Koro, letting everyone draw a card. On Shawn's turn, he plays a Swamp and casts Bloodthirsty Blade, followed up by Nils, Discipline Enforcer, and finally Master of Ceremonies. He then equips Bloodthirsty Blade to Veto, giving him +2/+0 and goading him. Then in his end step, Nils triggers, putting a +1/+1 counter on Veto, a bird token, and Kolfanor, also making each of Shawn's opponents pay X to attack him, where X is the number of counters on the attacking creature. On my turn, I cast Bantu's Monument, making all my black creatures cost 1 less to cast, and also making each opponent lose a life while I gain a life whenever I cast a creature. Unfortunately, Jason has an answer to this, countering it with Dovin's Veto. This also has both of us losing 2 life while Shawn gains 4. I then cast Pristine Talisman, losing 2 life while Shawn gains 2, and also cast Syndicate Enforcer, which has Extort. I also tap the Talisman to cast it so I gain a life to make Shawn lose a life, and then move to combat attacking Jason for 4 with my goaded Veto, but he blocks with Savine and prevents the damage. Jason attacks me for 2 and Shawn for 1 with his birds, and then in his second main phase casts Chain Reaction, doing 10 damage to all creatures since there are 10 creatures in play. This also makes Jason lose 2 life while Shawn gains 2 life, and when Kolfanor dies, Bilal returns Utopia Tree and Mazarek from his graveyard to his hand. Once that resolves, Jason casts Elminster, immediately activating his +2 ability to draw a card and scry 2. Bilal casts Karametra, God of Harvests, letting him search his library for a forest or plains and put it into play whenever he casts a creature, which he does, casting Utopia Tree and searching his library for a Snowfield Sinkhole, putting it into play. He also casts Grizzled Leotau, searching his library for an Indatha Triome, putting that into play as well. Finally, he casts Mindstone and passes. Shawn casts Deathbringer Liege, giving his white creatures +1/+1, black creatures +1/+1, letting him tap a creature when he casts a white spell and destroy a tapped creature when he casts a black spell. This lets him recast his commander Brina, tapping and destroying Savine. I play a Swamp and cast Bloodthirsty Aerialist, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever I gain a life, recast my commander, Tivash, using the Talisman so I gain a life, and putting a counter on the Aerialist. Then at the end of turn, I pay 1 life with Tivash to make a 1/1 demon token. Jason activates Elminster's +2 ability, drawing a card and scrying 2. He then casts Ral Storm Conduit, letting him do 1 damage to any opponent or planeswalker whenever Jason casts or copies an instant or sorcery. He activates Ral's -2 ability, letting him copy the next instant or sorcery he casts, which lets him cast Galvanic Iteration, which copies itself and also copies the next instant or sorcery he casts. Then, with the original Galvanic Iteration on the stack, he casts Increasing Vengeance, which is also copied, making the copy of Increasing Vengeance infinitely copy the original Increasing Vengeance, doing 1 damage to an opponent each time, knocking out the entire table and winning Jason the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. I definitely had a ton of fun playing the Tivash deck. It's very up my alley in terms of what I want to do. I just want to gain some life, pay some life, make a bunch of big, beefy demons, and start swinging into my opponents. So I had a ton of fun with the deck, and it really did what I wanted it to do. Unfortunately, we had a ton of mana and not much to do with it once Shawn's Archon of Emeria hit the board, because we were casting 1 spell a turn, despite the fact that we had, well, I didn't cast it for a while, but we had Bantu's Monument in hand, so I could have been casting stuff and gaining life and making my stuff cheaper, but that just wasn't in the cards, unfortunately. So not the best of showings, but I still think Tivash did a good job of showing the power that mono black life gain can have. On the other hand, if we go counterclockwise around the table, Shawn's deck did a very good job of locking down the table for most of the time with Archon of Emeria, and I feel like I always underestimate Archon of Emeria because, your opponents can only play 1 spell a turn, like that's not super great, they'll just play their big Haymaker and keep going, but it really made a difference in this game, and without it, Jason wouldn't have been able to combo off and win the game. It kind of kept me in check. It kept Bilal in check. He could only play one big creature a turn. So I think it was very impressive just to see how much work that one card put in. And then once he's able to get Brina on board, which combined with Doran, by the way, was a massive threat because he's swinging for like 9 commander damage right away. So a very impressive showing from Shawn's Brina deck, as always. Next up, we have Bilal and his Doran deck. Unfortunately, Bilal really couldn't get his wheels turning. He played a bunch of big creatures, but he couldn't find a way to attack without immediately getting attacked back for a lot more damage, so didn't quite do what he wanted to do in the end. And then finally, Jason played a very good game. I think he did a great job of kind of holding on to the cards that he needed until the end, kind of filling his graveyard when he needed to, and being able to combo off with Ral and a couple of spell copiers or doublers was very impressive. I'm pretty used to dying to Ral. It's a very well-known combo piece, but I'll be honest, I'm not super used to dying to it from Jason. He's very anti-infinite combo, so it was kind of fun to see him go off with his own infinite combo, but a very impressive showing from Savine, and once again, just proving the power of Savine. Like I said, a very strong commander, very powerful ability. So that was the deck for this week, the gameplay video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I had a ton of fun recording this video, had a ton of fun making the deck, playing the game. So if you liked it, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.